In the previous episode, we saw Miss Chi-Chi use her connection to get everyone into dwarf country. Up next, in the dwarf country, Leing was amazed to see so many dwarves busily forging weapons and armor. The dwarves are indeed a race skilled at forging. There are weapon and equipment shops everywhere. However, Holy Sword Alpha claimed that such a reputation was overrated. He insisted there was no one on the entire street who could match his own abilities. Elizabeth, puzzled, asked Leing why they had come to the dwarf country. The Sword Saint explained that the dwarf kingdom was the only realm maintaining trade relations with the kingdom of Aristotle. With the dwarf king's introduction, they might enter the kingdom of Aristotle peacefully, without resorting to battle. A dwarf named Brian then introduced herself and explained that Miss Chi-Chi had told him there was a way to help the dwarf country regain its ability to forge S-class weapons. Although he knew Mr. Leing had forged a card treasure, S-class weapons were far more complex. The sky color mine, once essential for forging, had already been exhausted. If they did not have absolute certainty of a solution, he suggested they avoid bothering his father, the Dwarf King, due to his notorious temper. Curious, Leing asked about the sky color mine. The dwarf explained that it was created by a meteorite that crashed into the brave continent 2,000 years ago. The enormous impact changed the local terrain and formed the mountain that now served as the guardian of the dwarf country, known as Holy Hammer Peak. He pointed to the massive mountain and added that the current dwarf king was conducting research in isolation deep within its mines. Meanwhile, inside Holy Hammer Peak, the dwarf king, Heimerdinger, was completely absorbed in his work. He had been desperately trying to create an S-class weapon. In his 10,997th attempt, he produced yet another A-grade weapon. Unsatisfied, he used the hardest tungsten iron to give it a final grind. First, he examined the results under 20 times magnification, then 100 times. But to him, it was still worthless. Enraged, he wondered what other materials he could use. He swore he would not let the Dwarven Kingdom's forging industry collapse on his watch. Just then, his son arrived with Leing and the others. Furious at being interrupted, Heimerdinger shouted at his son to leave and demanded that no one disturb him during his retreat. Despite his son's pleas, explaining that these guests were recommended by Miss Chi-Chi and might be very important, Heimerdinger only grew angrier, ordering them to get out. Miss Chi-Chi stepped forward and respectfully requested that His Majesty listen for the sake of their two guilds' long-term cooperation. She suggested that what they had to say might help him discover a new way to forge S-class weapons. Heimerdinger, still furious, ignored this. His son cautioned Miss Chi-Chi to withdraw before the Dwarf King lost his temper entirely. Suddenly, the Dwarf King used one of his own creations, flying boots, crafted from the feathers of the sacred snow-white bird, and sewn together personally by Heimerdinger. The boots allowed him to float like a feather and land in front of Miss Chi-Chi. "I am Heimerdinger, the greatest blacksmith in the world," he declared. "If I cannot solve this problem, no one can." He was massive, towering over everyone like a giant. Although Miss Chi-Chi was frightened, she insisted that there was someone who might actually succeed. Seeing her persistence, Heimerdinger felt insulted and threatened them, warning them to be ready for his wrath. He prepared to strike using his iron fists. Just then, a voice rang out. "Come forward and face me. When there is no tiger in the mountain, the monkey thinks itself king." Heimerdinger turned at once to see who had spoken. The moment he recognized Elizabeth, he trembled with fear. "Long time no see," Elizabeth said coldly. Realizing it was the Demon King herself, Heimerdinger immediately fell to his knees and bowed his head to the ground. Miss Chi-Chi and the young dwarf accompanying her were both stunned by this sudden change in the Dwarf King's demeanor. Kneeling before Elizabeth, Heimerdinger's whole body shook. "Your humble servant was ignorant and did not realize the Demon King had come to visit," he pleaded. "It has been 500 years. I truly thought—" Elizabeth regarded him with the same chilly gaze. "You thought I was dead," she said, "and planned to claim the title of king for yourself?" Leing, equally shocked, realized that the ruler of the Dwarf Kingdom was actually one of Elizabeth's subordinates. "I confess my countless faults," Heimerdinger said, trembling. "But please, Lord Demon, allow me to explain. I was truly left with no choice." Heimerdinger, the Dwarf King, explained to Elizabeth, "The world grows more chaotic by the day. As clan leader, I had to return to Holy Hammer Peak to rebuild the Dwarf Kingdom and protect my people." Meanwhile, the Dwarf King's son leaned over to Miss Chi-Chi and whispered, "Why didn't you tell me earlier that they're actually the legendary hero and the Demon King?" Miss Chi-Chi apologized. "Because the hero and the Demon King are trying to remain hidden, I couldn't just reveal their identities. But now that we know His Majesty, the King was once a subordinate of the Demon King, there's no need to conceal it anymore." Upon hearing the Dwarf King's explanation, Elizabeth grew curious about the rest of her former subordinates and asked for information. The Dwarf King nodded and began recounting what he knew. Wes Malfoy was the one who established the Dark Guild. He turned the world upside down, creating chaos everywhere. He has been capturing members of various races as test subjects for his life magic experiments, and many dwarves have fallen victim to his cruelty. Second Lord Jim Jimji has been searching for Elizabeth. Rumor has it he fell in love with a human woman and had a child, but later the Dark Guild targeted him, and he vanished without a trace. Mugor suffered a tragic fate. All the great orc chiefs united to betray him. This event, known as the starting point of the orcs' decline, ended in Mugor's death. Afterward, the chieftains carved up his territory, intensifying internal conflicts among the orcs. Even now, they struggle to unite under one cause. Twyla of the Elves is said to have blessed all elves with her life force, but beyond that, he knew nothing of her current situation. Finally, the kingdom Elizabeth wishes to visit, the kingdom of Aristotle, was originally founded by the high priest Barrow. Later, a man named Aristotle used the power of science to fight against the Dark Guild, rendering a great service to humanity. After his death, the realm was renamed the Kingdom of Aristotle in his honor. Because humans have short lifespans, countless leaders have come and gone since then, and the country has grown increasingly isolated. Despite this, for the past several centuries, they have continued to trade minerals with the Dwarf Kingdom. Elizabeth, enraged by how events had unfolded, shouted at the Dwarf King, "You fools! Knowing that the Dark Guild is on the rise, why didn't you all unite to resist them? Why act alone? Abandon your racial disputes and work toward world peace. Have you forgotten my orders?" Shaken, the Dwarf King bowed his head and apologized. "At first everyone followed your will, Lord Demon, but as time passed, self-interest and ambition caused many to stray. I was forced to return here." Leping stepped in to calm Elizabeth. "Don't blame them. It's like when there's no homeroom teacher in a classroom. There will always be people stirring up trouble." Elizabeth looked at Leping and, to everyone's surprise, smiled. "What you said makes sense." Miss Chi-Chi then turned to Leping and asked if there was any way to help the Dwarf Kingdom forge Super S-level weapons again. However, the Dwarf King's son, Brian, disagreed. "I'm not doubting the hero's abilities," he said, "but the exhaustion of the Sky Color Mine is a fact. Unless another meteorite falls from space, creating another source of this ore, it's impossible to make a Super S-level weapon." Reluctantly, the Dwarf King agreed with his son. "I've done more than 10,000 experiments here in seclusion. Without the Sky Color Mine, I can only replicate high-end A-level weapons, nowhere near the quality of S-level." Leping, a bit nervous, also found their arguments valid. If Super S-level weapons truly require the Sky Color ore as a material, it does seem impossible. "I'm amazed dwarves from another world could even use meteorite ore for forging." The Dwarf King corrected him. "The Tiankai mine, or Sky Color Mine, was never a raw material. It was a special grinding stone. Its story goes back to my grandfather's era. Long ago, dwarves were a nomadic people who traveled wherever they could mine and forge to survive. It wasn't until my grandfather led the tribe to these lands that we discovered rich mineral resources here, as well as the unique Holy Hammer Peak. Realizing the potential, my grandfather led our people deep into the mountain, right here in fact. Eventually, we unearthed a vibrant, multicolored mineral no one had ever seen before. Grandfather guessed it must have come from outer space. Out of curiosity, he struck at it with his hoe to chisel off a fragment for research. He never expected that, once he did, his ordinary hoe was transformed into a golden hoe. News quickly spread among the dwarves that using Sky Color Mine to grind their weapons could rapidly upgrade them. As a result, everyone brought their weapons to be upgraded. Day after day, year after year, the Sky Color Mine helped the dwarves forge ever more advanced weapons, ensuring their survival and leading to the establishment of the Dwarf Kingdom. However, due to excessive use, half of the Sky Color Mine was consumed. To conserve it for the long-term prosperity of their kingdom, the dwarves placed the mine under state control, restricting its use to only the top 100 forgers. Yet as conflicts with other races intensified, they needed more powerful weapons for defense. Access to the Sky Color Mine was gradually restricted from 100 users to 50, then 20, then 10, and eventually to the king alone. Fortunately, over 500 years ago, the Demon King, Elizabeth, subdued most of the interracial conflicts. This greatly reduced the need for weapon upgrades, slowing down the depletion of the Sky Color Mine. By the time Heimerdinger inherited the throne, only a piece of the Sky Color Mine the size of a watermelon remained. It was then used exclusively to forge personal utensils for the Demon King: knives, forks, cups, bowls, and dishes. When the Demon King abruptly disappeared 500 years ago and the world fell into chaos once more, Heimerdinger had no choice but to use the last of the Sky Color Mine to create additional S-level weapons. He allied with the Sword Saint Guild to resist the Dark Guild's incursions, but the final remnant of Sky Color Mine was fully consumed 5 years ago. Since then, Heimerdinger has tried countless times to find a suitable replacement, yet after tens of thousands of experiments, creating an S-level weapon without the Sky Color Mine has proven impossible. He lamented that the dwarves, whose entire forging legacy stems from the Sky Color Mine, might now face ruin, all on his watch. His son Brian tried to console him. "How could anyone blame you for this, father? If there's any fault, it's mine for not surpassing your achievements." After hearing Heimerdinger's story, Leping spoke up. He mentioned that he had considerable experience in forging techniques and asked if he might be allowed to try. Although he admitted he had little understanding of swords or magic, he was confident in his forging abilities and did not want to waste this rare opportunity to learn from the Dwarf King. Heimerdinger nodded in acknowledgement. Gazing at Holy Sword Alpha, he remarked, "If I'm not mistaken, the spirit of this blade is the same holy sword the Demon King first drew. I once attempted to replicate it, but discovered that it was a true natural creation, impossible to duplicate. Could it be that you, the hero, created something similar?" Leping shook his head nervously. "No, it's nothing like Alpha." Then he gave a gentle kick to Wang Chai, who retrieved a whetstone from his storage and handed it to Leping. Leping explained that he had brought his own forging tools to the Dwarf Kingdom for this exchange, and he often found that particular whetstone quite useful. He wondered if it might help them. However, Heimerdinger bristled with impatience. "Do you have any idea how many materials I've already tested? Your whetstone looks no different from those I've tried." Elizabeth, irked by Heimerdinger's dismissive tone, stepped forward and glared at him. "Heimerdinger, you dare to question my man?" Elizabeth tells Heimerdinger, "Why don't you go make the arrangements right now?" Terrified, the Dwarf King nods and quickly begins preparing for the weapon forging process. Leping is astonished as he notices the raw materials the dwarves use. Brian, Heimerdinger's son, explains to Leping, "This is a mixture of over 100 different mineral fluids. The exact proportions are determined by my father, based on centuries of experience." He then picks up a tool to ladle out some molten metal. Turning to Leping, he says, "Since the great hero has come to exchange pointers, allow me, Brian, to offer my humble skills first. I may not match my father's abilities overall, but I'm considered a genius blacksmith. My skill in crafting the rough shape of a weapon is nearly perfect." Brian scoops up the molten metal and tosses it into the air. Then he drinks something and spits it onto the flying molten metal. This is the dwarves' unique Aliforge tempering technique, in which they use wine to quench the hot iron and shape the weapon. As the smoke clears and the metal cools, the outline of a distinctive weapon appears. Brian grabs the newly formed blade and hands it to his father for the final, crucial step: grinding. Heimerdinger uses his iron jaw sharpening technique to give the sword its razor-sharp edge. Standing off to the side, Leping watches with amazement at the dwarves' unique and powerful forging methods. Once the sword is complete, Brian presents it to the Dwarf King for inspection. The sword is named 100 Minds, Raging Waves, Sword Drunk, with 2 special effects. 1. When the wielder is intoxicated, they gain a brief period of heightened excitement and become immune to pain. When striking a target, there is a 30% chance of causing that target to become drunk, provided the target's alcohol tolerance is lower than the wielder's. Leping is surprised to see that the Dwarf King apparently has an identification skill. Brian then asks his father what he thinks of the sword. Heimerdinger smashes the blade with his hand and says, although it has a special effect, it's only super A grade. Brian apologizes for his shortcoming, hanging his head. I'm sorry I failed to meet your expectations, father. But the Dwarf King reassures him, don't worry, you've done very well already. You're still young. In a few hundred years, you'll definitely surpass me. Brian thanks his father for his kind words. Then Heimerdinger turns to Leping, saying, you've seen our skills now. The Demon King may believe in you, but I don't think you can surpass the dwarves' forging techniques. Leping steps forward enthusiastically, eager for the Dwarf King to appraise his work. He is thrilled at the chance to see what kind of grade his own weapon might achieve. Watching from the sidelines, Elizabeth says to Miss Chi-Chi, it's rare for Leping to demonstrate his talents outside. Chi-Chi Saugus, your arrangement this time is commendable. Miss Chi-Chi thanks Elizabeth. Although the swordless style is good, not everyone can grasp it right away. With the Dark Sea's arrival looming, weapons at the dwarf level are indispensable. Meanwhile, Holy Sword Alpha is less impressed. S level, Super S level, none of it matters. Weapons that can't transform into a weapon spirit rely entirely on their wielders. By the original setting, I, Alpha, am the most powerful weapon in existence. Hearing this, Wang Chai asks Alpha, what about me then? Alpha replies, you're a piece of, smart furniture. That's beyond my comprehension. But I can tell you that those knives, forks, bowls, and dishes at home aren't weapon spirits either. Wang Chai, confused and excited, asks, then what are they? Alpha simply says, they're the abodes of gods, beings more powerful than any S-rank or spirit weapon. Back at the forge, Leping prepares to craft his weapon. He pours some of the molten iron into a knife-shaped mold. Heimerdinger looks on, unimpressed by what appears to be a simple knife. Once it takes shape, Leping cools the hot metal in water. With the knife now hardened, he proceeds to the final step, polishing. He picks up graphia to sharpen it. Watching from behind, the Dwarf King finds nothing particularly remarkable about Leping's methods. Brian, he asks his son, do you see anything special about his process? Brian nods. Our forging style is like a relentless pursuit of weapon quality, but he's enjoying the process. It's almost like he's forging for the joy of it rather than out of necessity.